were not to be found every day in Papeete. As it chanced, their man was at hand. The natives call him Tino. Perhaps his name had once been King. Years among the islands had obliterated whatever stamp of nationality he might have possessed. It was rumored that he was English by birth, and also that he had a commission in the Confederate Navy. Tall, strong, of fine presence, with a full blond beard and eyes of reckless blue, a great singer and dancer, always the merriest in a feast, and the idol of the women, remarkable linguist and story-teller, drunken, brave, witty, and unprincipled. Tino was of a type which thrives in Polynesia. When they offered him the position of superintendent at Faery, the two Frenchmen were not without misgivings. He was on the beach at the time, though the only sign of that condition was an unusual laxity in returning the favor when a friend invited him to drink. Tino had no money, but that was his sole limitation. Each of a dozen native families vied for the honor of transferring his mat and camphor-wood box to their house. When evening came, he had his choice of a dozen invitations to dine, and a dozen girls competed for the joy of doing his laundry and making hats for him. But this easy-going philosophy and lack of worry over a situation scarcely respectable in the eyes of Papeete's business men were calculated to sow distrust. In the case of Faery, however, it was difficult to see how he could go astray. There would be no liquor, they would see to that, and with no visitors and no means of leaving the island, there seemed to be little chance of trouble. Tino was a famous handler of native labor. The agreement was made, and in due time a schooner sailed into the Faery lagoon to land Tino and a score of Raritan boys with their wives. The Frenchmen took care to leave no boat capable of putting out to sea, but as there were houses and sheds to build, they left a considerable variety of tools and gear, in addition to a year's supply of medicine, food, and clothing. A day or two later the schooner sailed away. The superintendent called his men together and appointed a foreman. The main island was to be cleared, rows staked out, and the nuts brought for seed to be planted in such a manner. Before this work began, a house was to be built for each family. That was all, except that Tino needed 5 men at once for a special work of his own. Let them be those most skilled at woodworking. With that he seems to have dismissed the business of planting coconuts from his mind. There was a certain amount of hibiscus on the island, as well as the trees called tau and puka. In 7 months' time, with the help of his men, Tino cut down trees, sawed out timbers and planking, and built a 40-foot cutter, sturdy, fast, and seaworthy. Her mast was the smoothed-down trunk of an old coconut palm, her sails a patchwork of varied fabrics, her cordage of sinnet, twisted and braided coconut fiber. The work of women, incredibly skillful and patient. For anchor she carried a grooved coral boulder, and her water tanks were 5-gallon kerosene tins. At the end of the 7th month this improbable vessel was launched, rigged, and provisioned. Tino bade his men farewell and set sail, promising to return to the westward fearless and alone. His only instrument was a compass, and yet he made the passage to Fiji, 1,200 miles, in 15 days. I forgot to say that before his departure he had ordered the top of a tall palm chopped off, and on his stout flagpole had hoisted a homemade edition of the Union Jack. In Fiji he wasted no time. At the office of the High Commissioner of the Pacific he announced that he had taken possession of Faery in the name of the British Empire, and petitioned that a 50 years' lease of the island at nominal rate be given to him. The request was granted. A few days later Tino was again at sea, still alone, and headed for his little kingdom. The story is that he bought a sextant in Fiji, but at any rate something went wrong, and he was 50 days without a landfall. Think of this extraordinary man drifting about alone in his absurd boat, careless, self-confident, and unworried. Even Captain Slocum, said to have navigated thousands of miles of ocean with no other chronometer than a Connecticut alarm clock, performed no madder feat. Tino fetched up at a big lagoon island 600 or 700 miles out of his course. It is enough to say of his stop that he spent a week and left loaded down with provisions and drinking nuts, and accompanied by 5 of the younger and prettier girls of the village. This time all went smoothly. A plural honeymoon party enjoyed a merry voyage to Faery, where Tino established his large and amicable family, and proceeded to the less diverting business of planting coconuts. A year passed. A day came when the schooner from Tahiti rounded to in the lagoon and sent a boat ashore. Accompanied by his 20 men, Tino met the supercargo on the beach. Copra from the old trees? There was not much, but what there was belonged to him. This was a British island, and he was the lessee. Here were the papers to prove it. He regretted that as the proprietor he could not allow strangers ashore. Demoralize the labor, you know. The Frenchmen fumed, but they were too shrewd not to recognize defeat. The years passed in peaceful and idyllic fashion. A score of Tino's half-savage offspring fished and swam and raced along the beach. Then one day Tino fell ill. While he lay in bed, despondent and brooding over the unfamiliar experience, a schooner entered the lagoon and dropped anchor opposite the settlement. Her boat, trim and smartly manned as a yacht's gig, brought ashore the first missionary to set foot in Faery. Tino was difficult in the beginning, but the moment was perhaps the weakest of his life. When the missionary left, he had married the sick man to Mimi, his favorite wife, and received permission to install a native teacher for the children of the island. It amuses me to think of Tino's recovery and probable regret over his weaknesses. The thing is so natural, so human. Body illness and a spiritual reform have always gone hand in hand. But his word had been given in good faith. He finished the church and schoolhouse he had promised, and in due time installed a teacher among his flock. The supreme irony of the affair comes at this point, for the native teacher, on the lookout for a flirtation, was indiscreet enough to select Mini as the object of his attention, and ended by being caught with her under circumstances of the most delicate and compromising nature, as Tino said afterward. He had a score of women to choose from, besides 4 of mine who wouldn't have mattered, and then he picked on Mini. Why, damn it all, man, I was a bit fond of that old girl. The teacher paid dearly for his indiscretion. Tino lashed him to a post in the sun, where he probably would have died if the missionary schooner had not appeared just at that time. Cowed and whimpering, the culprit was thrown into a canoe by the indignant husband, who pushed off and paddled angrily alongside the schooner. "Here's your bleeding missionary," he roared out, as he hurled the struggling native into the lagoon. "I'm through with him. From now on this island will have to get along with me for teacher and missionary and king." That is all the story, except that Tino died not long ago, happy, rich enough, and surrounded by a numerous tribe of grandchildren. End of chapter 12.